The atmospheric processor for Sector 5 had been making the same grinding noise for 3 weeks, which meant Thomas Hartwell was probably going to spend another evening elbow-deep in recalcitrant machinery that predated the colonial wars. He wiped grease from his hands and glared at the readouts that insisted everything was functioning normally despite evidence to the contrary, including the mechanical death rattle that could be heard from 2 kilometers away. Another perfect day in paradise, he muttered to the empty maintenance bay, because talking to himself had become his primary form of social interaction since moving to New Eden. The frontier colony offered many advantages: breathable atmosphere, arable soil, and enough distance from civilization that nobody asked uncomfortable questions about your military service record. It also offered crushing isolation, equipment that held together through prayer and spare parts, and the kind of silence that made you miss even the most annoying conversations. His personal communicator chirped with an incoming message from the Henderson farm, which probably meant their hydroponic systems were acting up again. Thomas had become the unofficial technical support for every piece of malfunctioning equipment within 50 kilometers, a role that paid just enough to keep him in coffee and spare parts while providing the kind of routine that helped him avoid thinking about more complicated subjects. "Tom, we're getting weird energy spikes in the greenhouse arrays," Henderson's voice crackled through the speaker. "Nothing dangerous, but the readings don't match anything in the technical manuals." "Weird how?" Thomas asked, already gathering his toolkit with the resignation of someone who'd learned that frontier technology problems rarely had simple solutions. "Like something's interfering with the power distribution, but in a way that actually improves efficiency. The plants are growing faster, the energy consumption is down, and the atmospheric recycling is working better than it has in years." Thomas paused, a wrench halfway into his toolkit. "Equipment that improves itself isn't usually a sign of normal operation, Henderson. That's why we're calling you. Also, Martha wanted me to mention that she's making that stew you like, if you want to stay for dinner." The offer was tempting, if only because it meant human conversation and food that hadn't been reconstituted from basic molecular components. "I'll be there in an hour. Try not to touch anything that's working better than it should." The ride to Henderson's farm took Thomas across the rolling hills that had convinced him to settle on New Eden despite its numerous disadvantages. The landscape reminded him of Earth's agricultural regions before urban sprawl had consumed most arable land, though the twin moons hanging in the afternoon sky provided a constant reminder that he was very far from home. Henderson met him at the greenhouse complex with the expression of someone who discovered that his equipment was possessed by helpful spirits. "Tom, you need to see this. The energy readings are completely impossible." The diagnostic displays showed power efficiency curves that defied basic physics, as if something was actively optimizing the electrical distribution in ways that human technology couldn't achieve. Thomas ran every test he could think of, checked every connection twice, and finally admitted that the greenhouse systems were functioning significantly better than their design specifications without any logical explanation. "Have you noticed anything else unusual?" he asked Henderson. "Strange sounds, unexplained phenomena, mysterious figures lurking around your property?" "Now that you mention it, Martha thought she saw someone near the greenhouse last night. Tall, graceful, with what looked like pointed ears. But the motion sensors didn't detect anything, and there weren't any footprints." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach, a recognition that connected distant memories with present impossibilities. Pointed ears. Martha's eyesight isn't what it used to be, so she might have been seeing things. But she was pretty specific about the ears. 15 years of deliberately not thinking about his military service suddenly collapsed into the present moment. Thomas remembered elegant ears that curved upward like delicate leaves, remembered luminous eyes that held intelligence and pain in equal measure, remembered the weight of neural restraints as he broke them with a plasma cutter in a burning research facility. "Henderson, I need to check something at my station. If you see anyone near your property, don't approach them. Just, call me immediately." "Tom, you look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas almost laughed at the accuracy of that observation. Something like that. The ride back to his atmospheric processing station felt longer than usual, each kilometer weighted with the growing certainty that his past had finally caught up with him. The facility sat alone in a valley between two ridges, its collection of buildings and equipment barely visible against the landscape. Thomas had chosen the location specifically for its isolation, but now that solitude felt ominous rather than peaceful. He was running diagnostics on his primary power systems when he sensed movement behind him, a presence that bypassed every conscious thought and triggered memories buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself they were dreams. Thomas turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. She stood in the doorway of his maintenance bay exactly as she had 15 years ago, unchanged by time that had turned his dark hair gray and carved lines of experience around his eyes. Her pointed ears caught the evening light, and her luminous gaze held the same intelligence he remembered, but now it was paired with something new, a profound serenity that spoke of transformation and purpose. "Hello, Thomas," Serafina said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones. "I told you we would meet again." Thomas discovered that 15 years of frontier isolation had not prepared him for this moment. "Serafina. You haven't aged a day. My people experience time differently. For me, our separation has been brief. Long enough to understand the gift you gave me, but not long enough to forget the kindness of the human who chose freedom over orders. I broke some restraints and helped you escape a burning building. That's hardly a gift." Her smile was exactly as he remembered, beautiful and alien and somehow infinitely sad. "Thomas Hartwell, you gave me something my people had never known existed. You gave me the understanding that predators could choose to be protectors instead." As she stepped fully into his maintenance bay, Thomas noticed that the atmospheric processors around them were humming more smoothly than they had in months, their efficiency readings climbing steadily toward optimal parameters. Whatever Serafina had become during their years apart, her presence was already changing his world in ways he couldn't begin to understand. "I have something for you," she said quietly. "Something that will change everything." Living with a vampiric alien woman, Thomas discovered, involved significantly more logistical complications than 15 years of fantasizing about reunion scenarios had prepared him for. The primary issue wasn't her feeding requirements. Serafina's evolution had transformed her from an energy parasite into something closer to an emotional symbiont, but rather his complete inability to process the reality of her presence without resorting to increasingly elaborate coping mechanisms. "You've reorganized your tool storage 3 times since yesterday," Serafina observed, watching him rearrange wrenches with the desperate focus of someone avoiding more significant conversations. "Human nervous behavior is fascinating. I'm not nervous. I'm optimizing workspace efficiency." Thomas held up a plasma coupling as evidence. "This belongs with the plasma couplings, not mixed in with the atmospheric regulators. It was with the plasma couplings yesterday. Yesterday I was wrong about optimal tool organization." Serafina's ears twitched with what he was learning to recognize as suppressed amusement. "Thomas, you freed me from neural restraints and helped me escape corporate imprisonment. I don't think you need to demonstrate your organizational skills to impress me. I'm not trying to impress you. I'm trying to understand why you're here." He set down the tools and finally looked at her directly. 15 years, Serafina. You could have contacted me any time during those 15 years. Why now? Because 15 years ago, I was a broken creature who survived by draining emotional energy from unwilling hosts. I needed time to become someone worthy of the freedom you gave me. And now you're someone worthy. Now I'm someone who can offer you the same gift you gave me." She moved closer, her presence somehow making the cluttered maintenance bay feel more spacious and peaceful. "My people called it the crimson hunger. Our need to feed on emotional energy. But what you helped me discover is that hunger can be transformed into something nurturing rather than destructive." Thomas leaned against his workbench, trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about vampire species. "You're saying you don't drain energy anymore?" "I still require emotional sustenance, but I've learned to create symbiotic relationships rather than parasitic ones. When I feed now, I also give, healing trauma, processing pain, transforming negative emotions into positive energy." Her luminous eyes met his. I can share strength instead of stealing it. That sounds. Thomas searched for words that could encompass his confusion. Revolutionary. For your species, I mean. It is revolutionary. And impossible, according to every Noxari who still follows traditional feeding methods. Serafina settled into the chair he used for equipment diagnostics, looking perfectly at home among his mechanical projects. They believe I've become corrupted by human influence. Have you? I've become something new. Something that couldn't exist without learning compassion from the human who chose to free me rather than exploit me. The implications were staggering, but Thomas found himself focusing on more immediate concerns. Serafina, where have you been living for 15 years? What have you been doing? Learning. Traveling between worlds where trauma survivors need healing. Developing my abilities through practice with willing partners. She paused, her expression growing more serious. And searching for you. Searching for me specifically, or searching for humans who could teach you about compassion. Searching for you specifically, Thomas Hartwell. Because you're the only human who ever chose to help me without expecting anything in return, and because I have something to offer you that no Noxari has ever been able to give a human before. Before he could ask what she meant, his atmospheric monitoring systems began chiming with alerts that demanded immediate attention. The readings showed impossible efficiency gains across all connected systems, as if Serafina's presence was somehow optimizing every piece of equipment in his facility. Are you doing that? He asked, gesturing at the displays. Not intentionally. Symbiotic feeding creates positive energy cycles that affect nearby technology. Your equipment is responding to the emotional harmonics I generate when I'm content. You're content. I'm sitting in a room with the person who taught me that kindness exists, surrounded by the fruits of his honest labor, knowing that I can finally offer him something valuable in return. Her smile transformed her entire face. Yes, Thomas. I'm content. Thomas stared at his equipment readings, then at Serafina, then back at the readings that suggested his 15-year-old atmospheric processors were suddenly functioning at peak efficiency. Your emotional state improves my machinery. My emotional state, when properly channeled, improves everything around me. That's the gift 15 years of transformation has given me, the ability to create rather than merely consume. And the gift you mentioned bringing me? Serafina's expression grew serious, her ears shifting position in a way that suggested deep concentration. The gift of time, Thomas. The gift of sharing a lifespan that could span centuries rather than decades. The gift of partnership with someone who understands that kindness is the most powerful force in the universe. Thomas set down his diagnostic tools with hands that had begun trembling for reasons that had nothing to do with mechanical stress. You're offering to share your longevity with me. I'm offering to share everything with you. My abilities, my extended lifespan, my knowledge of technologies and cultures from across the galaxy. But most importantly, I'm offering to share the burden of being someone who chooses compassion in a universe that often rewards cruelty. That's. Thomas struggled with concepts that stretched far beyond his experience with atmospheric processing and frontier isolation. That's a significant offer. It's an unprecedented offer. No Noxari has ever attempted to create a permanent symbiotic bond with a human. The physiological and psychological integration could have unpredictable consequences. Such as creating something entirely new, a partnership that transcends species limitations and allows both individuals to become more than they could achieve alone. Serafina stood, her movement fluid and purposeful. But the choice must be completely voluntary, and you must understand that accepting means leaving your current life behind. Thomas looked around his maintenance bay, at the equipment he'd nursed through countless repairs, at the simple life he'd built from the fragments of his military career. Then he looked at Serafina, this remarkable being who had traveled across the galaxy to find him, who had transformed herself from predator to healer because of a moment of kindness he'd almost forgotten. What exactly would I be leaving behind? He asked. Loneliness. Isolation. The gradual decline of aging alone on a frontier world. Her expression softened. In exchange, you would gain partnership, purpose, and the opportunity to help others across the galaxy while sharing a bond unlike anything either of our species has experienced before. Thomas realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of his existence, however long that existence might last. The choice was between safety and transformation, between solitude and connection, between the man he'd become and the man he might yet become. The demonstration of Serafina's evolved abilities began with what she described as minor emotional harmonization and ended with Thomas questioning everything he'd ever believed about the nature of consciousness, energy, and the fundamental forces that connected living beings across the universe. Also, his coffee maker started producing beverages that actually tasted like coffee instead of caffeinated regret, which he considered a significant improvement. The symbiotic feeding process requires physical contact and emotional openness, Serafina explained, extending her hand with the patience of someone who'd spent years perfecting techniques that defied natural law. I will share your emotional experiences while providing you with energy that promotes healing and psychological integration. Thomas stared at her outstretched hand like it might explode. And this won't turn me into some kind of vampire. You will remain entirely human. The symbiosis enhances rather than transforms your species' natural capabilities. Her expression grew more serious. Though you may experience temporary sensory expansion and improved empathic sensitivity. Temporary. The effects fade within hours unless the bond is repeatedly reinforced. Think of it as emotional physical therapy. Thomas had undergone enough physical therapy during his military service to recognize a euphemism when he heard one. Emotional physical therapy that might have unpredictable consequences and could theoretically change my fundamental nature. Yes, but with excellent potential outcomes and minimal documented side effects. How minimal? Well, Serafina said thoughtfully, you would be the first human test subject, so technically there are no documented side effects. That's not as reassuring as you think it is. Thomas, you freed me from imprisonment and possible death without knowing anything about my species, my abilities, or whether I posed a threat to human safety. Surely trusting me with emotional therapy is less risky than that decision was. He couldn't argue with her logic, primarily because she was absolutely right and also because her presence was creating a calming effect that made rational risk assessment feel less critical than usual. Fine. But if this turns me into some kind of energy-draining monster, I'm blaming you in my official complaint. If this turns you into an energy-draining monster, I'll help you file the complaint personally. The moment their hands touched, Thomas understood why traditional Noxari feeding methods had been feared across the galaxy. The sensation was like having his emotional state downloaded, analyzed, and recompiled by a benevolent alien intelligence that somehow knew exactly which psychological knots needed untangling. Every buried trauma from his military service, the impossible decisions, the casualties he couldn't prevent, the weight of command responsibility that had driven him to frontier isolation, suddenly became manageable rather than overwhelming. But the process wasn't one-sided. Through their connection, he experienced Serafina's memories, years of imprisonment, painful medical experiments, the crushing loneliness of being treated as a specimen rather than a sentient being. And underneath it all, the transformative moment when a human soldier had chosen to help her without demanding anything in return, proving that compassion could exist even in the darkest circumstances. This is incredible, Thomas managed, though incredible seemed inadequate for describing the experience of sharing consciousness with someone whose emotional spectrum included colors that didn't exist in human psychology. This is beginning, Serafina replied, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones. The full symbiotic bond allows for much deeper integration. How much deeper? Deep enough that we could share memories, abilities, and even lifespan. Deep enough that neither of us would ever be alone again. The implications hit Thomas like a cargo transport at full acceleration. You're talking about a permanent connection. I'm talking about partnership in the truest sense, two individuals who complement each other's strengths while supporting each other's vulnerabilities. Serafina's grip on his hand tightened slightly. But I should mention that accepting full symbiosis would make you a target for the same corporate interests that imprisoned me 15 years ago. What corporate interests? The ones who've been tracking me across the galaxy, hoping to recapture their escaped test subject and study the evolutionary leap I represent. The ones who would pay extraordinary sums for the opportunity to analyze a human-Noxery symbiotic pair. Thomas felt his atmospheric processors choose that moment to emit a series of harmonic chimes that sounded suspiciously like an early warning system. Are they close? Close enough that we should probably discuss the full implications of my offer before they arrive. Serafina released his hand, and Thomas immediately missed the sense of emotional equilibrium her touch provided. The symbiotic bond would grant you extended lifespan, enhanced empathic abilities, and access to energy manipulation techniques that could revolutionize human technology. And the cost? Leaving this life behind and accepting that our partnership would make us refugees from both human and Noxery societies. Neither species has frameworks for understanding what we could become together. Thomas looked around his maintenance bay, at the simple life he'd built from the wreckage of his military career, at the equipment that had become his primary companions during years of self-imposed exile. Then he looked at Serafina, this extraordinary being who had traveled across space and time to offer him something he'd never dared imagine, the possibility of genuine partnership with someone who understood both his strengths and his failures. Serafina, he said slowly, if I accept your offer, what happens to us? We become something new. Something that proves love can transform even the most predatory relationships into partnerships built on mutual growth and respect. And if I decline? Then you continue living as Thomas Hartwell, atmospheric technician, and I continue searching for ways to help trauma survivors across the galaxy. We remain friends who shared a brief moment of connection, and I treasure the memory of your kindness for the rest of my very long life. Thomas realized that she was offering him not just partnership, but the freedom to choose his own destiny without pressure or manipulation. After 15 years of wondering what had happened to the alien woman he'd saved, he finally understood that saving her had been the beginning of his story, not the end. How long do I have to decide? As long as you need. Though I should mention that the corporate recovery teams will probably arrive within the next few days, so timing might become a practical consideration. Thomas laughed despite the seriousness of their situation. So no pressure, but my decision needs to be made before armed mercenaries arrive to kidnap my houseguest. That's an accurate summary of our current circumstances. In that case, Thomas said, reaching for her hand again, I think we need to discuss the practical aspects of becoming an unprecedented interspecies partnership while planning our escape from corporate bounty hunters. I was hoping you'd say that, Serafina replied, her smile brighter than the twin moons rising over New Eden's horizon. The corporate recovery teams arrived at dawn with the subtle approach of a meteor impact, their assault shuttles descending on Thomas's atmospheric processing station with enough firepower to level a small city. Thomas watched them approach through his security monitors while Serafina prepared for what she called defensive symbiosis, which sounded ominous until she explained it was essentially the equivalent of holding hands very intensely. 12 armed shuttles, full tactical deployment, enough personnel to invade a small planet, Thomas observed with the detached calm of someone whose life had become too surreal for normal panic responses. I'm starting to think your corporate admirers take their property recovery seriously. I represent 15 years of evolution that they want to study, dissect, and replicate, Serafina replied, her luminous eyes tracking the incoming ships. Also, our potential symbiotic bond represents breakthrough technology that could revolutionize their exploitation methods. Well, when you put it like that, I can understand their enthusiasm. The lead shuttle touched down 50 meters from his main facility, disgorging soldiers in full combat armor who moved with the precision of people accustomed to recovering valuable assets from uncooperative environments. Their commander, a woman whose corporate insignia marked her as senior management rather than military personnel, approached with a portable amplification system. Thomas Hartwell, her voice boomed across the facility grounds, you are harboring stolen corporate property. Surrender the Noxery specimen and you will not be charged with interference in legal recovery operations. Specimen, Thomas repeated to Serafina. They're still calling you a specimen. Some perspectives never evolve. Serafina took his hand, and Thomas immediately felt the familiar warmth of their emotional connection, but this time it carried undertones of power that made his atmospheric processors hum with increased efficiency. Are you ready to discover what we can accomplish together? Ready as I'll ever be for whatever the defensive symbiosis entails. The transformation began as soon as Thomas accepted the full depth of their connection. Energy flowed between them like liquid light, carrying not just emotional harmony but fundamental changes to his perception and capabilities. Suddenly he could sense the emotional states of every corporate soldier surrounding his facility: fear, determination, greed, and underneath it all, the uncomfortable recognition that they were threatening someone who had shown extraordinary kindness to their target. Thomas, Serafina said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through their shared consciousness, focus your attention on the power distribution systems throughout the facility. He did, and discovered he could somehow perceive the energy flows as living things rather than mechanical processes. More remarkably, he could influence those flows through conscious intent, redirecting power and optimizing efficiency through pure mental focus. This is impossible, he whispered. This is symbiosis. Your technical knowledge combined with my energy manipulation abilities. The corporate assault began with standard suppression tactics, electromagnetic pulse generators designed to disable facility defenses and communication systems. Instead of shutting down Thomas's equipment, the pulse was absorbed and redistributed through channels that transformed it into enhanced power for his atmospheric processors, which began generating localized weather patterns that reduced visibility and interfered with the corporate team's targeting systems. Dr. Vex, the corporate commander's voice crackled through her communicator. The target appears to have developed defensive capabilities not documented in our intelligence reports. Impossible, came the reply. Noxari abilities don't include technological enhancement. Tell that to the atmospheric system that just created a localized thunderstorm. Thomas grinned, feeling more energized than he had in years. Serafina, I think I'm beginning to understand your gift. You understand the beginning of my gift. Would you like to experience the full transformation? Will it hurt? It will change everything about how you experience existence. Pain, pleasure, time, consciousness, all of it will expand beyond human limitations. And afterwards? Afterwards, we become partners in the deepest sense. Two individuals who share abilities, memories, and a lifespan measured in centuries rather than decades. The corporate forces were regrouping for a more serious assault, their heavy equipment suggesting they'd moved beyond property recovery into full military engagement. Thomas realized that his choice was no longer between his current life and partnership with Serafina, it was between transformation and capture. If we do this, he said, watching weapons platforms deploy around his facility, what happens to us? We become something unprecedented. A human-Noxari symbiotic pair with capabilities that neither species could achieve alone. We become proof that evolution can be guided by love rather than survival necessity. And our mission? What would we do with these remarkable abilities? Help others discover that predator-prey relationships can be transformed into partnerships. Travel between worlds where trauma survivors need healing. Prove that compassion can create stronger bonds than exploitation ever could. Thomas looked at the corporate forces preparing to storm his facility, then at Serafina, whose trust in him had never wavered despite the years and distances that had separated them. Serafina, 15 years ago I freed you because it was the right thing to do. Today I'm choosing to accept your gift for the same reason. And because you love me. And because I love you, he admitted, finally acknowledging what he'd been trying not to recognize since her return. Though I should mention that I have no idea how to love someone whose emotional requirements include feeding on psychic energy. You already know, she said, drawing him into an embrace that carried the weight of 15 years of separation and the promise of centuries together. You love by choosing connection over isolation, by offering support without expecting anything in return, by proving that kindness is stronger than fear. The full symbiotic transformation felt like dying and being reborn simultaneously, every cell in Thomas's body adapting to accommodate capabilities that had never existed in human physiology. When it was complete, he opened eyes that could now perceive energy patterns invisible to normal human vision and felt Seraphina's presence not just beside him but integrated into his consciousness. "How do you feel?" she asked, though their connection meant she already knew the answer. "Like I finally understand what I was meant to become," Thomas replied, testing abilities that allowed him to manipulate matter and energy through focused intention. "Also, like we should probably leave before the corporate teams finish preparing their siege weapons." "Already handled," Seraphina said, gesturing toward his facility's main power core, which was building energy in ways that definitely exceeded manufacturer specifications. "Our combined abilities have turned your atmospheric processing station into a remarkably effective spacecraft. My maintenance facility can fly. Your maintenance facility can do anything we need it to do. That's the beauty of symbiotic partnership. Reality becomes more flexible when two minds work in perfect harmony." As they lifted off from New Eden's surface aboard the most unlikely spacecraft in galactic history, Thomas Hartwell realized that freeing an alien vampire 15 years ago had been the single best decision of his life. And as they set course for the unexplored regions where their unprecedented partnership could help others discover the transformative power of compassion, he understood that their greatest adventures were just beginning. "So," he said, settling into the pilot's chair of his newly aeronautical atmospheric processing station, "where should we go first?" "Wherever healing is needed," Seraphina replied, her hand finding his as they flew toward stars that held infinite possibilities. "We have centuries to explore the galaxy together, and eternity to prove that love conquers everything, even the laws of physics."